I'm going to be talking about something that's been troubling me for the best part of, well, more than 30 years really, and that is, what are the effects of daylight on school children's health? And in particular, what does it do to their eyesight? So I was originally involved in, as a mechanical engineer. My background was in solar design, so I designed solar collectors before it was fashionable to do so, a long, long time ago. And then I was actually involved in a project, one of the ones was for the Russian Mir space station. I was looking at solar energy for that, but came to nothing. But I eventually moved on to, I was asked to do a survey of what were known as passive solar schools in the UK. In the early 80s, passive solar was seen as the future for energy efficiency, as it was then known. And so I was set off to go and find all the passive solar schools I could and take photos and write about them. So I went and did that, and of course during the course of that I saw a lot of different school types and a lot of different approaches to designing school buildings. Some of them had big windows, some of them had small windows and so on. Some were designed for sunlight, some weren't. And I then joined a team of engineers and building scientists whose job it was to monitor passive solar buildings to find out if they worked or not. So it was a very intensive and very detailed monitoring program that went on for quite some time. And we found in the end that the passive solar buildings were far more effective in terms of energy efficiency than the equivalent non-energy efficient non-solar buildings. And during the course of that work, we interviewed the occupants of houses and offices and schools and so on, and said, what do you think of these buildings? And they all very much enjoyed being in passive solar buildings. And so I thought, well, I'll try and find out what it is that they like, because you've got to bear in mind this is in the days before circadian rhythms and seasonal affective disorder and all the rest of it. And that was still in the future for the lay reader of the literature, shall we say. So I went and had a look at the literature then available to find out what were the benefits of designing a building for daylight. And I could find virtually nothing. There were no references to the health benefits, particularly, other than there was a psychological impact, in inverted commas. But I knew from my work I'd done on the other buildings, looking at school design, that at various times schools had been designed to let the sun in. And so I set off to try and work out what constituted a healthy school and what constituted a healthy building. And I'm still looking. Well, this is one of the ones I looked at and wasn't able to resolve. So that's a school in Hampshire. Hampshire had a very good reputation for building passive solar schools and won awards and so on. And that was one of the ones we monitored. I didn't do that one, but that's the interior. So it was designed, as I say, to let the sunlight in. Again, at the time, there was no evidence that that had health benefits. There has been some research published not that long ago that showed that the passive solar schools in Hampshire and Essex achieved better academic performance than the equivalent non-solar schools. But again, that was way after I started looking at these things. So what I'm going to do is just take you through a few of the schools that I have been associated with over the years in one way or another, just to give you an outline of different approaches to designing schools and the health of school children. And I'll start with one of the first I attended, and that was built in 1558. And when I was a little lad, I used to go there. As you can see, it was, by the standard of some of the schools that came after, quite well daylit. And very memorably, you had to walk through a graveyard to get to it. And it had originally been a grammar school, one of the first grammar schools. And by the time I was sent there, we used to go in there for school dinners. And it has recently been refurbished and restored. So that's 460 years ago what a school looked like, roughly. And that was the junior school I went to. And that was what is known as a village board school and was built in 1878. Now the school next to it was that's the primary school. The school next to it was a junior school, I think built at the same time. And that was built according to what is sometimes referred to as the Prussian plan. And what that meant was the Prussians were at that time world leaders in child education. and their architecture transferred. So that school was a large central hall with classrooms round 3 sides opening onto the hall, and the 4th wall had all the gymnasium equipment at the bottom stored, and then above it was the head teacher's office. So the head teacher could look down into the hall and see all the comings and goings from all the classrooms, and then the whole school would meet in the assembly area, and he or she could look down from above, much the same way as they do at May Day in Moscow. So it was very much a school for, if you like, social control. The health element of it was not particularly highly developed in those days. Again, I didn't attend this school. This is an open-air school, but I believe my mother may have. These schools, again, came from Germany, originally from Berlin, the first one. The idea of open-air therapy actually came from Birmingham, where this was built. There were 5 open-air schools in Birmingham, and I think this may have been the one she went to. Well, what happened was, if you were in a family that had a history of respiratory infection, particularly tuberculosis, you were taken out of conventional school and put in one of these schools. She, I think, had scarlet fever, and her brother had diphtheria, very ill with diphtheria. So they would have been seen as at risk. And of course, the other problem when she was around was malnourishment, because you're talking about the Great Depression, and a lot of children went hungry. So they were sent to these schools to effectively toughen them up. They were well fed, but they were exposed, as was the fashion with tuberculosis treatment, to cold, fresh air. So the 3 sides opened up, and the back wall was for writing on. So I asked her, she didn't talk much about her child, but I asked her about it. She said, yes, we used to have to wear boots, a coat, a hat, and gloves to survive in there. And the trick was always to get the desk by the radiator, if you could. But I mean, the stories are that the ink used to freeze in the inkwells in those schools. But the idea was to toughen the children up. So they had a lot of exercise, they were well fed, and they were given a lot of rest as well. So they'd be going out on walks and then they'd be asleep. And the one thing I asked her was, did they put you out in the sun? And they did. So at that period, of course, sunlight was used. From the 20s onward, it was known to prevent and cure rickets, which was the most common childhood disease of the period, certainly going into the 20s. So children were put out to try and stop them getting rickets. Vitamin D deficiency was known about by then. And sunlight was also used to treat children with tuberculosis of the bones and joints, and there were hospitals for sunlight therapy. So children were put outside because of concerns about tuberculosis and to prevent them getting it. Now I have a conflict of interest here. It's not a long list, but in the 1960s, when I was attending the first school you saw, the old school, I contracted what is now referred to as a drug-resistant infection. So I was taken to the doctor, and she gave me everything she could to get rid of it, and none of it worked. So she said, write to my parents, put him out in the sun. So I had exactly the same sunlight therapy that gained Niels Finsen the Nobel Prize in 1903. I was given sunlight therapy for an infection. It wasn't tuberculosis in my case, which is what he got his Nobel Prize for, but I was given sunlight therapy for an infection that didn't, and I didn't know about this when I started doing all my research. I didn't know about this till I'd finished my first book, which is a bit of a pity. But there, I'd forgotten all about it, but yes, I had sunlight therapy. So just to show you an example of a school that's built for sunlight for health, rather than as I was monitoring when I started energy efficiency. This is an open-air school that was up in Scotland, and really it's designed, the classrooms are designed to be south-facing. You probably can't see it, but they have long verandas so the children could go out under cover. Designed for sunlight penetration. There were clerestory windows along the back so you could cross-ventilate. So in effect, this school was the same design pretty much as a tuberculosis sanatorium of the period, when they were using sunlight and fresh air to treat the condition. Sadly, somebody set fire to that, so it's no longer there, so I can't go and see it. But that was one example of one of the sort of buildings that was designed for sunlight, and to exploit, amongst other things, the therapeutic side of sunlight, but also the germicidal effect. Because one of the things about schools is they are notorious reservoirs and incubators of infection. And the first thing you shut down in an influenza pandemic is the schools. And just a little historical note, I checked the other day, And the school I showed you that I think my mother went to was the only one in Birmingham that remained open during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Because effectively everybody was outdoors, and you don't catch influenza if you're outdoors. You catch it if you're indoors. So there we are. So that's Sunlight, a Sunlight school. When I left my junior school, went up to secondary school, and that's sort of typical of the classrooms I spent the rest of my education in. Now you could call those, if you like, daylight factor classrooms, because that was the driving feature of these. If you look at them, they're designed for diffuse light, for skylight, and it comes in from the left so that all the right-handed pupils can see to right. I am, of course, left-handed. So two of the things that are absent from those classrooms is any form of solar shading. And also they most of them opened directly onto corridors, which meant that if any sun came round, it was going to get in, and as they opened on the corridors, you couldn't cross-ventilate them. So we used to have a thing, an announcement came round at school, shirt sleeve order. And that meant the classrooms were getting so hot, you could take your blazer and your jacket off. That was always a problem all the way through. Or, of course, you could put the blinds down and turn the fluorescent lights on. But that didn't really solve the problem. So that was a design approach that went on for, I don't know, many, many years, 70 years, probably longer than that, is getting skylight in, usually north light in, to the classroom so that right-handed people could see to right. And one of the things that puzzled me as I looked at all this over the years is occasionally I would see quotes like this in the literature as I went through it to try and work out what was going on. The eye of a child is a growing eye and more susceptible to damage from deficiencies of lighting than the mature eye. Unsuitable and inadequate lighting may leave its mark on any child, affecting his comfort, efficiency and earning powers throughout his life. And that came from a Ministry of Works report on daylighting from 1944. And that was typical of the thing I would read occasionally. I'd think, oh, what's that about, really? Because when I was in the 80s, the idea that light in any way affected children's eyesight was a medical myth by that time. I don't know if I'm allowed to say an old wives' tale, but it had been relegated to that position by then. There was no evidence to support it. And if you read the report that comes from, they actually say, well, we're not absolutely sure, but we're going to take the precaution of making sure that they've got enough daylight because of the damage that myopia does. Right, so what is myopia? Very briefly, a healthy eye, a normal eye, the light focuses on the retina at the back. A myopic eye elongates slightly, and so the light does not focus on the retina, so you have to have it corrected. Again, I'm no expert, but the first scientist, if you like, to identify the optics of myopia was the German astronomer Johannes Kepler. And he did drawings of the eye and showed what was happening with a myopic eye. And he also said myopia is a problem among children who do a lot of close work. And that was his diagnosis of myopia. And in the 400 years since then, opinions have varied markedly. One school has said that myopia is an inherited condition, and the other school is that it's an environmental condition. So at various times it's believed to be entirely hereditary, and others it's thought to be environmental and steps put in place to try and stop it, such as the classrooms I showed you. So that's been ongoing. And so has my research. And I was trying to work out what this was all about, the lighting. Where did it come from? Because I couldn't find the origin. I always try and find the first paper that was written that tells you why you should be doing something. And I couldn't find it. And it was only about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I actually found the paper. And it was written by Professor Rudolf Virchow, who was a Prussian doctor, world famous, well, certainly famous throughout Europe. And he was effectively the first pathologist that we would now recognise, Virchow. He sort of established the discipline of pathology. And in 1869, I found a paper of his in which he'd gone through health records of school children, because Prussia had introduced compulsory state education following the Battle of Jena against the revolutionary forces of France. They lost badly, and so they decided to educate their people, and they brought in compulsory state education. So this would be about 60 years after that, I would think. And Virchow went through the top 10 things that school attendance does to children. So things like tuberculosis and posture and so on. And he was alarmed to find that top of the list was it damaged their eyesight. And if you read his paper, he said, and you can see that as they go through school, the longer they're in school, the greater the chance that they actually become short-sighted. And this wasn't his research, it was based on another Prussian doctor, a Professor Cohn of Breslau University, who was an ophthalmologist. And what he'd done, he published his paper in 1867, and this was the origin of all the ideas about lighting and health in schools. And he'd gone out and he'd measured the eyesight of 10,000 school children. And what he found was that those who attended school in the countryside had better eyesight than those attended school in urban areas. They had less myopia, less short-sightedness. And he went into the schools, and that's where he found that the longer children were in school and the more academic and intensive their education, the greater the risk of myopia, and once they got it, the more severe it became. And the third thing he found was that he actually measured the light levels in the classrooms. And what he said was, you get more myopia in classrooms that are dark than in classrooms that are light. And the problems occurred mainly in urban schools, because quite often they were in narrow streets overshadowed by other buildings. And so what he made them, he didn't have a photometer in those days, so he made them read newsprint. That's how he measured it. And he said, well, if you look at the figures, dark classrooms produce short-sighted children. And the figures he quoted then are very similar from the figures you get now, actually. In the most academic schools, up to 50% of pupils were leaving short-sighted at the very academic end of the German education system. So that's where all this idea of light affecting children's eyesight comes from a study in 1867 published in Leipzig. So no wonder I had trouble finding it. Oh, it hasn't gone very well. Anyway, myopia, daylight factor or sunlight? Direct sunlight. I'm afraid it hasn't transferred from the PowerPoint to PDF too well. But never mind, it's striking. So you've got these two schools of thought on how you design, because what Cohn said when he published his work, he said, effectively, the minimum should be 1/5. The window should be at least 1/5 of the floor area. Ideally, you would get as much light into a classroom, natural light into a classroom as you can, including sunlight. And he said, ideally, what you would do is light a classroom from above as well, so you bring light down from the top. And that was very much one school of thought. What happened was that when the problem of myopia transferred to this country, the eye experts in charge took a different approach. Because Germany had, Prussia and then Germany had compulsory education for about 80 years before we did. We didn't start till 1880, so school myopia, as it's known, was new. And one of the things that they did was they set up schools for children who had early onset myopia. Because the earlier you get myopia, the more severe it gets. So what they would do, if they identified a child who had early onset myopia, they'd send them to a special school. And these were known originally as myope schools and then became known in America as sight-saving schools, because they were concerned that these children wouldn't lose their sight. And if you read those practitioners, they said, oh, we must get sunlight into the classroom for these children who are at very high risk of getting worse with myopia. So there were two schools of thought. The German school was diffuse light from the left, skylight, daylight factor, which is pretty much where the daylight factor came from. Get it in from the left, And then you've got these British practitioners who are saying, no, actually you need sunlight. So there are two schools of thought on that. Let's see what else we've got. Pathological condition or optical inconvenience. Again, there are two schools of thought on myopia down the history. One is that the term used originally in German literature and later British literature is that a myopic eye is a diseased eye. It was considered a medical condition. And then the other school of thought is that it was, and it is, an optical inconvenience. And what happened in Prussia, from my reading of the literature, is originally it was seen as a harmful condition, and then it was seen as part of some sort of evolutionary process of German society towards a higher form of civilization. So they stopped talking about it as a pathological condition, and it was part of an evolutionary process. Whereas in Britain, it remained for a long time considered to be a disease, and so they were much more proactive in trying to stop it, and introduced a lot of legislation in schools, for example, to maintain good daylighting to stop children becoming short-sighted. So we get to the 1960s and late 50s. A lot of schools were destroyed during the war, and then there was a baby boom, so there was a very rapid building process, and of course that was a mass-produced process. They had system-built schools that you may be familiar with from that period. One of the problems with them, they were of course designed to satisfy the daylight factor requirements in legislation, but again quite a lot of them were built without due regard to the solar ingress. So overheating became a bit of a national scandal in schools eventually. They were very cold in the winter, as I remember, and very hot in the summer. So, daylight in the 1960s. Big changes happened in the 60s, which is why I couldn't find anything in the 1980s. The therapeutic and germicidal effects of daylight were no longer considered important in hospitals or schools. If we go back, of course, hospitals were designed for sunlight. If you go back to Florence Nightingale, it was all about helping patients recover if you put them in a sunlit ward, and cutting down infection rates if you put them in a sunlit ward. And as you've seen, schools and tuberculosis sanatoria were designed for direct sunlight to help patients recover. But by the 60s, this had gone. I caught the tail end of sunlight therapy, but that had pretty much gone by then. Okay, the other one, by the 60s, a report was published in 1962 by the Medical Research Council, and the conclusion was that myopia was overwhelmingly hereditary. The environment played very little part in it, and so from that point onwards, measures to prevent it were not taken. So the idea of daylighting schools, for example, to prevent myopia stopped, and other measures too. And finally, the big one that I didn't realise at the time until I went through the literature was that up to the 1960s, daylight was considered more important than artificial light for lighting a building. It always had primacy because of its health effects. By the 1960s, that distinction went. The argument was one of the arguments was that natural light coming through glass, once it had been through glass, it was no longer natural. So it's no healthier than a fluorescent light. And that came to dominate lighting from then on. I read a paper, I haven't found it, I can't find it, but there's this chap and he's talking at the time, and he's saying, if God had invented the fluorescent light before the sun, he wouldn't have bothered with the sun. And that was the attitude in the 1960s. And so you get, from then on, in America particularly, windowless classrooms came in. Part of the idea was to stop children looking out of the window, but it also made them a lot cheaper to run and all the rest of it. And they still have them. They built some in Germany, but I think they knocked them down in Germany. But you still get windowless classrooms. Of course, the thing with the window is, we now know, of course, that views out are therapeutic, and a view out might even stop you getting myopia. And of course, sorry, I've gone on too fast. The other thing, of course, we didn't have that in this country. What we had was windowless hospital wards. So particularly intensive care units, if you have the misfortune to go to an intensive care unit, you might find yourself in a windowless one. And that has a very, very damaging effect on patients. Post-operative delirium and so on. So we went the other route and applied that to our hospitals. So that's enough of the history. What's happening now? Well, last year a paper was published and it described a new classroom that's been built in Guangzhou in China, and that is designed to test the hypothesis that high levels of natural light will influence the amount of myopia that children get. So it's designed, it has, as I understand it, fixed solar shading, so it won't overheat the way some of the schools I was in did. And as you can see, it's actually got a translucent ceiling, so they're actually bringing light down, just as Herman Cohn said you should have 150 years ago, 100 years ago. As far as I'm aware, there are no test results yet, but it's ready to go. And I was contacted last year by a research group in Peru, and they're also going to conduct tests on lighting in schools to see if it affects the rates of myopia. So, it is referred to now in the popular press, not just in the academic press, as an epidemic myopia. It's doubled, I think, since I was at school, it's doubled here, and it's doubled in the United States. And in certain parts of the world, particularly South Asia, it has reached epidemic levels. In some communities, children now leave school almost entirely, the whole cohort will leave school short-sighted. So 80 to 90% of school children in some parts of the world are now leaving school short-sighted. And future trends, a paper came out last year in ophthalmology, and they predicted, obviously you have to be a bit cautious about these trends, 2050 is a long time away, approximately 30% of the world's population suffer from myopia at the moment. And they predict that by 2050, half of the world's population, or nearly 5 billion people, will be short-sighted. And of these, somewhere between a tenth and a fifth of the people who become short-sighted have severe myopia and are therefore at risk of going blind. So myopia is a leading cause of blindness. So if that occurs, even now, the social and economic burden of having lots of myopic people is significant, very significant. And the other fact I should mention before I finish is that research also shows that any level of myopia increases your risk of eye-threatening conditions. So things like cataract, retinal detachment, glaucoma, macular degeneration, these things are associated with myopia. Obviously, the more myopic you are, the greater the risk, but the literature suggests that any level of myopia increases the risk. So, that's the question. Is it a neglected aspect of public health? Well, we don't know, is the answer. Until these reports, these studies are undertaken, we don't know. But when I think back to my days, this is an old man reminiscing now, when I was at school, we were not allowed to stay in the classroom other than during lessons. We had to be outside. Break time, lunchtime. If it was raining, you still had to go outside. We played a lot of sports on sports fields. And of course, I think a lot of those things were introduced to stop myopia. The idea of having playgrounds, the idea of having sports fields. Because if you go back to the literature then, they said children who are outside a lot don't get myopia. And that is exactly what the literature is saying now, that children who are outside a lot don't get myopia, they're protected from it. Some of it says that sunlight protects against myopia, and there's the ongoing debate about whether close work, reading, is a factor too. If we go back to Herman Cohn, who was the pioneer in the field, he said it's a combination of a hereditary component, there is a hereditary factor, bad lighting and too much close work, is what he reckoned, and we still don't know. But hopefully this will be resolved soon, because obviously there is a major public health issue going on. All right, so I hope that was interesting for you. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much for that. Questions?
In terms of the causes of myopia,
Yeah.
has there been any research to indicate whether, I mean, if you're indoors all the time at low light levels,
Yeah.
your eye's having to adapt to the close work.
Yeah.
Higher light levels, your iris shuts down, so your depth of field is much greater, so the muscles need to work less hard or can stay relaxed on a long distance.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're outside a lot,
Yeah.
you're looking at distant objects, so the focus, you've got high light levels as well, but your focus point is greater. So is it to do with the range of usage of the eye that causes it to focus less well on? I mean, I'm old, so I can't focus on close things now. But
yeah, there are many schools of thought. One is that it's the way the eye works outside protects against myopia. So obviously you're not doing close work, you have peripheral vision. It's a very different visual environment from being indoors. So that's one school of thought. The other is that it's dopamine in the eye, that bright light influences the amount of dopamine that's secreted in the eye, and that affects the growth of the eye. And then there's the school of thought that it's too much close work. So these things haven't really been resolved.
And we can't carry out the appropriate experimentation on human subjects.
Well, that's what they're going to do in that classroom.
Actually, can I throw in one part here? I think there was a study a year or two ago which looked at different cohorts. I think it was in Southeast Asia, where it was some were playing sports, but indoors. So it was like five-a-side football indoors. So there was focusing at a distance.
Right.
But they were still showing their higher incidences of myopia compared to those who were playing sports outside.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's the big debate, is whether they should be doing exercise, and the consensus seems to be that it isn't the exercise. It's the amount of time they spend outside seems to be the deciding factor. And of course, as you saw with the picture I showed of the Asian young people all wearing glasses, it is very much the culture there to spend all day indoors when you're studying. So they spend long periods. They're not like when I was at school when you kicked out during the day. They spend a lot of time indoors studying, so they don't get the experience of being outdoors. So I guess if children went to the open-air school that my mother went to, it wouldn't be a problem. But yeah.
I have actually a comment or question.
Yeah.
In 2016, in Germany, we organized a light symposium where we had different speakers.
Yeah.
And we invited a medical doctor from Dresden who is actually researching a lot of, impact of different light sources on human health and also eye. And he was looking at the not actually myopia. What you're presenting. But the macular degeneration. They could actually prove that infrared and near infrared could actually, improve.
I've read the literature on that. Yeah.
So maybe it could be also a connection in here.
Yes, I mean, yes.
That that from the daylight, you will have the actually what's missing in artificial lighting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's. I have looked a bit at that. Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about the health effects of infrared, and obviously I'm not an expert, as you may have gathered by now. I'm a simple engineer, so I don't know much about what I'm delving into. But I've gone through as much of the literature as I can to try and solve something that puzzled me, and it looks like we might be getting nearer to the solution.
Could I pose a question, maybe? Perhaps more at Stephen actually. Is there any? Do we have any understanding of any underlying mechanism why myopia should be an indicator of increased risk for other conditions?
I don't. I've tended to study people much further down that visual impairment scale. So we've been looking at generally people without any light perception, without eyes. We haven't looked at risk factors around disease development. But I suppose that anything that makes the eye function less optimally is going to put strain on it, and I think that's it's a general.
what happens is, because the eye, I mean, in extreme terms, if you think of a soccer ball and a rugby ball, a myopic eye is closer, it isn't actually, it's only a minute elongation. But the eye elongation is enough to change the shape of the eye, and the attachment of the retina and all these things gets more difficult as the eye gets more myopic. So it changes the actual shape of the eye, which in turn increases the risk for these conditions, as I understand it.
Question about
I've worked as a teacher and a daylight consultant for a while. I think when I did my teaching qualification, I tried to look at if there were any studies of daylight in the effect on kids, and that was about 15 years ago, and there was nothing then. I think there's been a bit since. There's this big school building programme at the moment.
Yeah.
That, from what I hear, certain aspects of how the buildings will be designed would go contrary to how a teacher might have done it. For example, the corridors are quite narrow, prescribed to be quite narrow, which any teacher will tell you will mean there'll be disruption in a high school, for example. Has any of this been incorporated, or any of the studies that you said were happening with the passive solar school and so on, has it been incorporated into the new school building programme?
I'm not that familiar with the new school building programme, I have to say. It's a long time since I was involved in school design. But these days, it's very difficult to put sunlight into a building because they're so highly insulated. So the idea, I mean, these days, sunlight is referred to as glare. So it's difficult to accommodate. So it's unlikely that they will design, it will be designed for sunlight, I would think. So,
sorry, yeah.
You carry on. No, yes.
On the Priority Schools Building Programme, as I think many people know, climate-based data modelling was made a mandatory requirement. And part of the rationale for that was the concern with overheating, because with the BSF programme in the mid-2000s, a huge number of those schools were overheating very badly, and news reports of children fainting and so forth. So EFA, my understanding is that they introduced CBDM to make the consideration of sunlight part of the daylight evaluation, which I think is a good thing, but I would say I think their criteria are not onerous enough, because they allow the same facade design to just about pass with a northeast and south elevation. When if CBDM tells you anything, it should be that those facades orientations are performing very differently and should get different treatments. Yeah. But it's cost that's driving all of these things.
Perhaps there's a future study, if the effect is so strong on the myopia, perhaps there's a future study on the schools that are being currently produced to see what the effect is on the people's eyesight.
Yeah, I mean, it will take, based on my experience, it will take a long time before that happens. Because, I mean, I was writing about vitamin D deficiency 20 years ago, and it wasn't a popular subject to be writing about then, I can assure you. Now it's in the mainstream. And I suspect with this, it'll take some time before it gets anywhere near the mainstream. Silence.
Oh, I'm surprised.
I'm
Yeah.
going to make an observation which hopefully ties both of our speakers this afternoon together. What Stephen has mentioned about making light sources which stimulate selectively is potentially unlocks some of the areas which we have difficulty with, is that if we look at, in terms of schools at the moment, the recommendation there is a sort of threshold of about 300 lux on the horizontal surface as being the sort of cut-off point between it being daylight being regarded as adequate, so obviously much of that is going to be above, and the need for supplementary artificial lighting. And given what you've said, Richard, and what we've heard about entrainment, and maybe we should be rethinking the threshold level for our design. Now, the higher we put it, the more difficult it is to design with daylighting, as we know from experience. But looking at the group of evidence rather than specific things, maybe this is where we should be looking towards encouraging those who create guidance and beyond that regulation to be rethinking. It sounds like a statement rather
than
a question.
Yes, a statement rather than a question. Yeah. I mean, I always say, when people ask me about sunlight in buildings, they always say one person's glare is another person's phototherapy. And the thing to bear in mind with this is that hunter-gatherers don't get short-sightedness. It's only when they're brought into settlements and their children are sent to school that they become short-sighted. And when that was first discovered, it was put down to hereditary factors. But it's actually because they're put in an environment that puts some sort of strain on their eyesight and the way their eyes grow. So yes, I don't. It would be nice to see design guidance on preventing myopia, but until the actual, well, how shall I put this? If you wait for the scientific explanation for something, you may be waiting a long, long time. And clearly, when I was at school, people involved in designing those schools acted without a scientific explanation for what they were doing. They saw it as a means of ensuring or providing insurance that they might be able to stop children becoming short-sighted. So they didn't wait for the definitive answer before they acted. And that's one of the things that's changed.
So with the principle of, like shares, of doing no harm, can actually encourage us to take, in a sense, anticipatory action rather than waiting for the evidence.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things which your very cogent presentation today presents us with is that if we look a little harder, there is a very substantial amount of evidence, maybe not of the quality of double-blind trials, but it's to provide us with reassurance that we'd be going in the right direction if we took it.
Yeah, as I say, but
we have very little data, next to nothing, on actual operational performance in schools, because we're not recording any luminous quantities. The ambient light sensors, they're not recording lux and they're not logged. We're recording temperature and CO2 and so forth, but no routine measurements. So even if you have a notionally well daylit classroom, if the teacher comes in and pulls down all the shades because they're using this sort of technology all the time, it's no longer a daylit space.
But John, if I may, if we look at the records which probably exist of myopia in this country over the last 150 years, we could probably chart the variations in school design through that. And if we see a growing level of myopia as a trend, come what may, then the most likely cause is the type of buildings we'd be putting you.
Well, I think,
given what we've been listening to today.
It's not, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do is actually sit down and try and design a school to prevent myopia, but I couldn't get the money to do it. But I've looked at a lot of the literature, and it isn't just the classroom, it's the school day. So when I was at school, as I said, I looked at figures for national service when I was at school, the last cohort of national service, and about 20% of the recruits had eye problems, and most of those were myopia. And of course, as I say, go back then, it was very much an outdoor culture in our schools. You weren't allowed to stay indoors any longer than you had to. So it isn't just the classroom and the lighting, it's actually what they were doing. And of course, you weren't allowed to take a transistor radio in, never mind a smartphone or a tablet. They wouldn't have been allowed anywhere near one of those when I was at school. So there's none of that close work going on outside the school, which obviously has an impact. So the school day, as I say, 20% of recruits for our national service. If you look at the figures for Singapore, it's something like 80 to 90% of their recruits for military service are now short-sighted. And of course the military are getting concerned because if you've got all short-sighted people, it affects your military efficiency. Parents as yet are not. They are in Singapore. There are campaigns to try and get them to take their children out and walk them around, but as yet it's not really a concern amongst parents. There we are.
There could be also another aspect that actually the children are, all of them, nowadays they're having mobile phones and they are having, the laptops and they're actually sitting there.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. So you wouldn't have been allowed to do it. Yeah, it's just, the lifestyle plays its part. Yeah.
Yeah, on that, I was just reading that Oculus is experimenting with different focal distances and varying focal distance in its VR appliances. Yeah. And so I was just wondering, I mean, it's probably not the solution we would ideally want, which is to go outside. Yeah. But I was just wondering, do you think that will have an effect? If you are consuming media through a device with varying focal distance?
It might do.
That
it might be a way around it, but until you'd have to do a lot of experiments to prove it. And of course, if you came out with the lighting system that prevented myopia, you'd obviously be a very wealthy person. The danger is we will go back to the windowless classroom. That is my concern, is that everybody will say, oh, we sorted this out. But I think myopia, again, is more than just classroom design itself. I think there's more involved in it than just...
Something else I thought that sort of brought together both the presentations is if you ask any teacher, especially primary school teachers, they'll tell you that how much the weather affects the kids after a break. Most noticeably the wind. If it's been windy at break time and the kids come back in, they're really rowdy. If there's some effect with the light as well, just that we were saying before the break about the light affecting attention. I wouldn't be surprised if there's also an effect with a little burst of daylight that they get at break time, perhaps increasing their attention after break.
Yeah.
I know in Finland they're very fond of having frequent breaks outside the kids, and they're well known for having very good educational results. And the teachers say there that I think there was a study where the English teachers said, how can you teach with the breaks coming so frequently? And the Finnish teachers said, we couldn't teach if the breaks didn't come so frequently.
And that's an old style of education, of making sure that regular break times, breaking up education.
And just staking them out if they're a particularly rowdy class. I mean, I think they're great.
Yeah. You take them out and just put them out and bake them. Yeah, you won't come in until you're tanned. Yeah. So that was the old way of dealing with the diseases of infection. And of course, one of the ironies is I wrote a book many years ago, 1999. I finished by expressing the hope that we'd never ever need sunlight therapy again for tuberculosis. And a paper was published last year, and it said that drug resistance in tuberculosis has reached a stage where we may have to look at using sunlight therapy for it again. So if you wait long enough, your suit comes back into fashion. There we are. Okay.
Okay, are we just about done? Yeah. I'd just like to thank both of the speakers again for